It's been all over the news. Russia building up troops on the border and potentially invading Ukraine. But are they really going to do it? And if so, could they even win? And what about the US? Would they get involved? Or could they even stop a Russian invasion? But real quick, our sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a real cool app. It's a real unique idea that helps give people the whole picture of what's going on. Too often today, each side will downplay negative stories or just completely twist it to push their own agenda. And it may give you a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling to hear that you're right, but you will never find the truth that way. It's a similar problem with my work. The US says Russia is going to invade Ukraine, for example. Well, then I have to look and see what Russia is saying. And that's where Ground News is awesome. They take and compare how news stories are being covered on all sides of the political spectrum. It gives you the whole picture that you otherwise would never get without spending a lot of extra time searching. They also have other tools like the bias distribution chart or the blind spot feed, which shows you stories that are being underreported or even not reported at all by the other side. So go check them out. It's free, no need to sign up or anything to get started. Go to ground.news/covercabal and download the app. First, the history of Ukraine is important to understand. Ukraine was originally part of the Soviet Union. In 1991, it declared its independence. Relations between Ukraine and Russia were somewhat complicated. At one point, they even discussed joining NATO in 2005, something that was extremely divisive amongst the population. But relations with Russia then greatly improved with the election of Viktor Yanukovych in 2010. In 2014, however, everything changed. The Ukrainian Revolution saw the removal of the more pro-Russian Yanukovych from power, and the new leadership taking a more pro-European Union approach. Shortly after, the so-called Little Green Men began appearing and seizing key government sites, airports, and military bases in Crimea. While first claiming that these troops were not Russian forces, and that they had no control over them, Putin himself later admitted that they were in fact Russian military. Crimea was then annexed after a vote, becoming part of Russia, and shortly after, a larger civil war broke out in eastern Ukraine, which has also seen Russian military forces take part in. Russia then held larger than normal military exercises near the border with Ukraine and built up a large number of troops, but despite all the talk about a full-scale invasion in the Western media, it never happened. The civil war has since mostly become a stalemate, with not much change taking place in the last 6 years. It's also important to note that Ukraine is a pretty divided country, where a large percentage of eastern Ukraine is ethnically Russian, so the history of pro- or anti-Russian administrations have been contentious. But since 2014, Ukraine has been leaning more toward joining NATO. This would yet again put NATO right on Russia's doorstep, but this time within 500 kilometers of Moscow itself. So it's no surprise that this would be a concern to Russia. Since the ending of the Cold War, NATO has crept closer and closer. Poland joined in 1999, followed by Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in 2004, all three of which were previously part of the Soviet Union, and now the prospect of Ukraine and potentially Georgia joining as well. This all leaves Russia in a precarious position. You could probably imagine how the US might feel if several nations, like Cuba, the Bahamas, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Jamaica joined a military alliance with China, for example, and then Mexico talking about joining as well. Regardless, it's been all over the media that Russia has been building up troops on the border with Ukraine. Numbers of troops are stated to be 70 to 100,000 in the vicinity in the last few months alone. A relatively small base near Yelnya, home to Russia's 144th Guard Motor Rifle Division, has seen a massive buildup of various combat vehicles in the past few months alone, for example. Here, 5 Russian BTGs, or Battalion Tactical Groups, have arrived between June and November. If an invasion did happen, just as in any war, they'd want to do it quickly. That would cut back the time Ukraine has to further mobilize, and also lessen any time for any other nation to get involved. First, you'd want to strike vital targets. Ukraine has a lot of leftover, decently capable air defenses, like the S-300Ps spread across the country. They also operate many shorter-range Buk and Tor systems as well. These would complicate air operations for Russia, so they would need to be taken out first. So air defenses, along with key command and control sites to disrupt Ukraine's ability to mount an effective defense, and air bases so that Russia could have control of the skies. Once you have air superiority, it would make it next to impossible for Ukraine to fully fight back, as any major troop movements, moving tanks around, etc. could be spotted and bombed with impunity. Russia has a few options to do this. They operate hundreds of shorter-range ballistic missiles like Iskander. These can attack targets deep into Ukraine from Russia. They have also shown off things like their KH-101 air-launched cruise missiles in Syria in 2017. These missiles have ranges well over 1,000 kilometers, enabling them to hit anywhere in Ukraine without the bomber ever even entering into Ukrainian airspace. Or Kalibr, a missile similar to the US Tomahawk, which is launched from warships and submarines. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, headquartered in Sevastopol in Crimea, consists of at least half a dozen improved Kilo-class submarines that can fire that caliber, along with many surface ships that can as well. Perhaps also interesting to consider would be Spetsnaz groups infiltrating and seizing, or at least sabotaging, key locations at the outset of the war, similar in a way to what we saw in Crimea in 2014. Or even sending in forces to seize control of government locations, such as the Verkhovna Rada building, which houses Ukraine's parliament, or the office of the President of the Ukraine. We saw the Soviet Union use Spetsnaz forces to do just this in Afghanistan in 1979. After the opening strikes, the ground war would begin, with the Ukrainian Navy and Air Force consisting of mostly outdated equipment, such as old MiG-29s and Su-27s left over from the Soviet Union. Ukraine would have to rely on its ground forces, and they actually have a somewhat capable force, consisting of over 100 T-84s, over 300 of the less capable but still effective T-80s, several hundred older variant T-72s, and over 1,000 of the real outdated T-64 tanks. Battles taking place between Ukrainian and Russian troops in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 15 showed us some interesting results. As expected, Russia won most of them, but Ukraine did have some tactical victories, although not decisively. Russia relied on their Battalion Tactical Group, an organization of motored rifle or tank units, along with recon, artillery, anti-armor units, and other attachments. These are extremely effective in many ways, such as offering greater support assets, and they can pack a serious punch in a concentrated area. However, they also have several downsides. A BTG is more ad hoc, and makes coordinating large-scale operations across a wide area while still maintaining security to their flank and rear nearly impossible. Also, casualties become much more costly and quickly degrades combat effectiveness, more so than, say, a US BCT, or Brigade Combat Team. Ukraine exploiting some of these weaknesses in Russian BTGs enabled them to achieve some victories. Further, being able to take advantage of this could allow them to put up a decent defense for some time. However, Russia was also fighting, in a sense, with one hand tied behind its back. They did not send in large numbers of air support, for example, something that Russia has a large advantage in over Ukraine. But compared to Russia, in the end, it wouldn't be enough. Ukraine's main hopes would be dragging out the conflict long enough for the UN or other countries to intervene and bring it to a stop. Whether or not Russia would stop, or accept a ceasefire, maybe in exchange for annexing more of eastern Ukraine, is anyone's guess. The big question would be if the US gets involved. As it stands right now, the answer seems pretty clearly no. President Biden held talks with Putin, warning him of increased sanctions and economic consequences, but stopped short of any talks of coming to Ukraine's defense. Also, it would take a lot of time to mobilize and send in US forces, all the tanks and vehicles, and all the necessary supplies for Ukraine. So, realistically, any US military support would be limited. The only military option available immediately for the US would be sending in air support, like fighter jets and bombers, or launching Tomahawk cruise missiles. However, these actions are unlikely to change the outcome. You would need boots on the ground in the end, and from what we've heard from President Biden, that seems unlikely. Instead, the US and a few allies have threatened sanctions. But, again, this is all presupposing that Russia actually invades Ukraine in the first place. They do appear to be building up forces in Western Russia, but that is inside their own country after all. And Russia has built up large forces before, and carried out exercises in the region in the past, while several media outlets report that it could be the lead up to a full-scale invasion, which we now know never happened. So, we can only really wait and see.